人はいつ死ぬと思う?
Tony Chopper never had the chance to hear his mentor say these words, because Dr. Hiriluk made sure that he wouldn't be present to hear them. It's only natural for a father to conceal his martyrdom from his son. Besides, it would have been redundant to impart this particular wisdom on Chopper, the one person who could never forget him. These words, which fell almost entirely on deaf ears, were meant to act as a lifeline for any semblance of sympathy in that audience. It happened to be Dalton who succumbed to the kindness of Dr. Hiriluk. Like Chopper, Dalton was also a Zoan half-breed, and he too became a disciple of the same inherited will. Perhaps the Zoan affliction, that curse of being half-human, contributed to the unwavering altruism of both Chopper and Dalton. Chopper's trauma certainly led to an insatiable need for approval, which Hiriluk taught him to cope with through acts of selfless love. On the surface, Dalton's case seems less clear. He was a confident and self-assured leader, fluent in combat and strong of heart. However, any effort to look closer reveals just how tragic these strengths truly were. His combative capabilities had been used for ill, to oppress his fellow countryfolk. His heart had been weak enough to sin in cowardice by permitting such misuse of his skills. All his confidence and self-assurance came from an obligation to atone for Wapple's tyranny. Dalton realized that although foolishness could not be cured, the life of a country could be allowed to atrophy and die off by replacing its memory. In other words, every act of kindness done by him could help extinguish the bad memories of the Drum Kingdom, and thereby end its legacy. Again, Dr. Hiriluk was responsible for lifting a heart out of despair by teaching the lesson of selfless love. The value of love permeates throughout all of Drum Island. This is because of the emphasis placed on the scarcity of love in the desolate husk of a monarchy pillaged by demons and obscured by blizzard, to the degree that people often pass by each other without seeing each other. The coldness and the discolor don't just physically blind them. These things actively tuck away their passion to live. They would rather refuse treatment than give up their material assets. That's how starved for hope people are in this country. When the going merry arrives, like a plague ship bearing the contagion of hot-blooded compassion, Drum Island's immune system instinctively rejects the pirates. The kindred idealism shared by Dalton and Vivi is what allows the Straw Hats to enter onto the island. When Luffy and Sanji begin their hike, another immune response triggers and causes an avalanche. But one act of generous kindness from Luffy unearths the loyalty of the Lapins. Even in a wintry kingdom hell-bent on suppressing love, mammals are still subservient to that warm-blooded need to repay their debts. Memories continue to live on after death. Inherited will can transcend the imprisoning inevitability of death, and thus the impulse to do justice lingers from generation to generation. This is why, when someone has a promise to keep, not even death can take their life away. At Reverse Mountain, at the entrance of the Grand Line, the first thing that Luffy and the others saw was a behemoth whale with behemoth mental health issues. 50 years of rumination on the nature of love and the sanctity of friendship had left Laboon in a state of reckless despair. His trauma went so deep that Crocus had to take up a dwelling inside of the whale's stomach in order to practice any sort of treatment at all. The very first human being the Straw Hats met in the Grand Line was a doctor who dedicated his life to acting as the sole agent of Laboon's immune system, the same way Dalton and his followers appointed themselves as the guardians of their homeland. Baroque works struck like a virus, not just at Laboon, but at the notorious ogres of Elbaf, and, most significantly, at the kingdom of Alabasta. As soon as the shadows of Crocodile's scheme were introduced, it became apparent just how essential it would be to have a knowledge of medicine and disease. Between Reverse Mountain and Drum Island, the severity of the Grand Line only continued to worsen until it drove the navigator of the Going Merry to the brink of death. The recruitment of a doctor quickly became the highest priority of the Straw Hats. Like Frankenstein's monster, Chopper was born into a state of isolation. The gift of human intelligence alienated him from his own species, and his uncanny animal nature aroused a violent paranoia among civilized people. The wounds of a heartless cycle of rejection did not have to be nursed alone, however. Hiriluk treated Chopper's dire craving for companionship, and nurtured in him an empathetic heart. Dr. Hiriluk diagnosed Chopper as an outcast, but he did not abandon his patient, unlike the infamous Dr. Frankenstein. Instead, Hiriluk prescribed mercy and gave the monster a second chance at life. Hiriluk's devout idealism not only educated Chopper in the humanities, but also liberated Drum Island. Wapple may have been defeated by Luffy, but the true villain of the story was in fact that invisible germ of heart sickness caused by the scarcity of love, and Hiriluk was the only one to confront it head on. As a physician, Hiriluk's modus operandi was his devout idealism, which was what enabled him to diagnose the actual problem of his kingdom. To the common public, he was just a quack doctor who wreaked havoc with his pseudoscience. But in truth, his failings came from the most noble of intentions. The miracle cure to which Hiriluk dedicated his life served humanity in ways that ordinary medicine could not. This is the reason why, as a self-proclaimed doctor, he willingly drank poison. Let's entertain the obvious for a moment. Hiriluk raised a monster like Chopper as a son. Once he saw the approach of his death, Hiriluk's fatherly instincts activated, and he resolved to keep this burden from his child. When Chopper was forced away, it set him on a journey to discover a way to save his father's life. The next time that Hiriluk laid eyes on his son, he saw how far he had been willing to go for the sake of love. In that moment, absurdly enough, love transformed poison into medicine. Chopper had inherited his father's bleeding heart, which is a scientific proof of the power of a person's love. Thus, in the name of love, it was far more important to reward Chopper's bravery than it was to punish his ignorance. Either way, Dr. Hiriluk's life work had prepared him to die proudly, so he entrusted his will to his son Chopper and his sister Kureha. Kureha was a proper doctor, a foil to Hiriluk's relentless compassion. Her metaphorical Jolly Roger was the caduceus, the symbol of the snake-like pragmatism that characterizes the practice of medicine. After all, the Hippocratic Oath confers the duty of piously abstaining from all whims of the heart's hubris. Like a counsel of the law, a physician must be impartial to these temptations. To transgress upon this code is to risk undue suffering. In accordance with her sense of justice, Dr. Kureha learned to practice medicine on a case-by-case basis. Her aim was to get results. Her metric of evaluating her patients was asking them if they were happy. The eternal youth she flaunted was her credibility, the proof that she could conquer the insufficiencies of the body. Where her brother Hiriluk churned out his last 3 decades of life on a romantic quest in search of some holy grail of medicine, Dr. Kureha chose rather to resign herself to an unnaturally long life of benevolent artifice. The decision to live in such an understated manner may have seemed like just a quirk of Kureha's character, but once again, beneath the stoic professionalism, there were demons at play. The way that she reacted to Chopper's negligence, the way that she scorned Hiriluk's ambition, the way that she would force her patients into submission in order to cure them properly, and the way that she would refuse to leave them with any kind of debt to her. These things revealed the lengths she would go to resist the temptation of foolish dreams and unfinished treatment. To put it simply, Dr. Kureha strictly adhered to her physician's ethics because of how much she feared death. Nevertheless, Kureha did eventually subscribe to Hiriluk's vision. She worked secretly for 6 years to prepare the operation. The night that Chopper departed with his new friends, he looked back behind him, and in the spotlight of the full moon, he beheld his father's dream come true. Pink snow, like beautiful cherry blossoms, enveloped the summit of the island in a haze of warm-blooded ecstasy. Dr. Hiriluk had accomplished his miracle cure. He'd given the people of Drum Island a memory that could never die. After all, the memory hadn't ever died in him. That simple spectacle of passionate beauty had once been the cure that Hiriluk needed to save his own moral soul. and once saved, not even 1,000 physical deaths could divide him from his own humanity. The answer that Hiriluk had found was beauty. His 30 years experimenting with alchemy were spent on creating a work of art that could draw people's attention away from the hopeless fog of their everyday reality. Then, they could forget the bad memories and replace them with the memory of spontaneous beauty, a lasting reminder of the existence of true love. The beauty that comes from people is like a light in the darkness, illuminating what the naked eye cannot see. The essential metaphor here is that Dr. Hiriluk gave his people a tool that could help them detect the invisible germs of love. This was the great scientific discovery that he passed down. Two doctors from Drum Island treated Chopper's heart. Hiriluk's medicine was love, and Kuriha's medicine was truth. A third person, who had no medical background whatsoever, also treated Chopper, and his medicine was the final key to Chopper's happiness. Luffy's freedom was the last treatment needed to provide Chopper with a chance at a life of his own. From Drum Island, the Going Merry set sail to Alabasta in order to unleash its contamination upon a people blinded not by blizzard, but by sandstorm. The sickness in this case was caused by the warlord Crocodile, who commandeered the patriotism of Alabasta's citizens in order to overturn their government. Crocodile's name alludes to the phobia of Captain Hook from the story of Peter Pan, and his ability is the power to control sand. This man, who thematically represents the scarcity of time, was the one who tipped the hourglass which would count down to Alabasta's civil war. The same way that sand slowly scrapes away at cliffs, Crocodile eroded the fragile hearts of the people in order to bring a kingdom to dust. Like Dr. Kuriha, he feared death so much that he was willing to commit himself to a rigid code in order to escape it. His code, however, was much less honorable. Instead of treating the sick, he used them for his own gain, in blatant contradiction to the Hippocratic Oath. What the code of Baroque works could not fully account for was, in fact, the contagious love that Princess Vivi had harbored for so long. With Luffy's help, she performed the same miracle in Alabasta that Hiriluk had performed on Drum Island. She showed the public the beauty of her heart, her inexplicably invincible love for her citizens. During the heat of battle, only one voice clashed against the chaos with any sort of lasting clarity. That voice belonged to her that never once abandoned the hope that the hearts of her people could be unfettered. Among the vassals who sheltered Vivi's dreams, only one succeeded in cutting off the head of Baroque works. Luffy wanted to fight Crocodile from the moment he saw the town of Yuba. Even a dimwit like him understood what kind of state Alabasta was in, that the virtue of unconditional love would not be enough on its own to cure it. Against the erosive force of time, sacrifices must be made. Luffy won because he was willing to sacrifice his blood for the sake of Alabasta's will. Nico Robin was a germ within the greater virus of Baroque works, which itself was a symptom of the Seven Warlords system. Admiral Aokiji characterized her as a woman who chronically sabotaged the groups she was a part of, a parasite. According to the judgment of CP9, Nico Robin was a devil child, and according to the Five Elders, she and her ilk were errors in the human code. The mission of the world government at large was to purify the human race, to which end they executed their philosophy of absolute justice. Impurities, such as those cursed with the guilt of victimhood, would be subjected to the cleansing hand of authority. The world government's catastrophic brutality touched friend and foe alike, for in the eyes of Marie-Joie, even the potential for evil must be eradicated. So when the people of Flevance contracted a terminal disease from their livelihoods, the world government exterminated every last man, woman, and child. one little boy survived, and his reality was so clouded by trauma that he became a monster. His heart was broken not by a scarcity of love, but by an abundance of hate. Trafalgar Law's transformation led him to the doorway of Don Quixote do Flamingo, a fellow demon equally driven towards blind hatred, whose indiscriminate madness was contained behind shades so opaque that no one else could ever peer into his eyes. For some time, Law became one of his most prized marionettes. That is, until Rozinante cut the strings. What Rozinante saw in Law was identical to what Doflamingo had seen originally. However, Doflamingo, being the vain monster he was, perceived through his crimson spectacles a mirror of himself. Corazon saw, rather, through the lens of his clownish pity, someone in need, an orphan like himself who hadn't fully lost his heart yet. The very moment that Law decided to pay back Corazon's silence with silence of his own, he revealed the tiny amount of humanity that still festered inside of him. This was Corazon's cue to escort him along a recklessly romantic endeavor for the sake of redemption. Law's journey alongside Corazon led to many failures, but the time they spent together welded an emotional bond between the two of them that would ultimately guide them to a miracle cure. It was not medical science that helped Law, because the physicians had all been institutionalized in their prejudice against white lead disease. Instead, they would need to snatch a devil fruit right out from under Doflamingo's nose. This could only ever have worked if Corazon was willing to lay down his life in the process. For Law, he was. After the constant agony of being rejected by the world, he found himself at the edge of a cliff, wondering why he had harbored any hope for Law to begin with. In an uncharacteristically verbose moment, Corazon blurted out his true intentions point blank, drunkenly unaware that Law was listening. That tiny mistake corrected the course of Corazon's journey. Without that, Law may never have found himself willing to live. In essence, Corazon would never have succeeded if he wasn't as clumsy as he was. Two things gave Corazon the advantage in this final quest: his silence and his foolishness. After all, Law wasn't just sick with white lead disease, he was also infected with Doflamingo's influence. Doflamingo, who manipulated with his words, was perfectly countered by Rozinante, the man who could silence anything. That silence served as his scalpel as he removed Doflamingo's cancer from Law's mind. In his blindly selfless love, Corazon never even realized that he was in fact performing surgery on Law's psyche. In the end, Corazon was successful in saving Law's life, and in passing down everlasting memories of goodness, for which Law was so grateful that he tattooed those memories all over his body. Regrettably, however, hatred is unkillable. The final confrontation between Doflamingo and Corazon became an image that would imprint itself upon Law's memory. His angel and devil had gone to war, and the devil had won. Doflamingo had the final say when it came to Trafalgar Law's conscience. Just like Chopper, it took the intervention of the Straw Hat crew to liberate him completely. Don Quixote Doflamingo was a man whose very existence left wreckage in its wake. Everything that he inflicted his touch upon became corrupted. Like a buzzard drawn to rotting flesh, Doflamingo was intrigued by the romantic culture of Dressrosa, and in the heat of his orgiastic violence, he raped the kingdom to death. Then came his ships in the night, and he asserted himself as the new tyrant king. Dressrosa's soul was put away and forgotten about, and its sheep were goaded into a listless compliance to their seducer. The public was fed on melodrama and cheap conflict, while their heroes endured mental torture. the nightly thrusts of vengeful intercourse, the daily vulgar puppet show of bloodshed, these routine occurrences composed the rhythm of Dressrosa's heartbeat, so that when the mist of subjugation finally lifted, an entire country was able to cheer for their true savior. Even the staunchest upholders of justice made an exception that day. The silent cries of Dressrosa had filled Fujitora's ears enough to drown out the orders of his celestial overlords. As for Sengoku, he had kept his eyes on Doflamingo's business for so long that it didn't matter if Luffy and Law escaped. He chose rather to celebrate Rosinante's life and the inheritance of his will. Sengoku helped Law finally begin to understand what it was Corazon was pondering on that cliffside years ago. Just as Doflamingo was blind in his hatred of the world, Corazon was blind in his love for life. His love came from his own foolish heart. He was an imbecile, nothing more. In fact, it might have been harder for a more intelligent man to have saved Law's life. Don Quixote Rocinante was no physician, but like Chopper, he had the physician's most important qualification, a big heart. A great doctor can cure entire kingdoms and rescue the souls of the damned. The most powerful treatment can span the world and transcend history, like an antibody spreading itself through the anatomy of time and space. Boundless love can yield light in an otherwise hopeless situation, and for that reason, it is the most effective medicine for monsters. Hiriluk's beauty, Corazon's emotion. These are the uniquely human expressions of that boundless love that saves people. And these forces of ceaseless good thrive in the monstrous chaos of the Grand Line because that is where they have the most value. The world's cruelty cannot hold a candle to the undying memory of a person's kindness. Thank you for listening all the way through my essay. I hope you enjoyed it. I've had this idea of creating a video to compare Chopper and Law before because, they were both traumatized little monsters who decided to become doctors and help people, and I thought that was really interesting. I started writing this actually while I was sick myself in a kind of fever dream haze watching the Drum Island arc at midnight, but it really wasn't until I started writing this essay that I realized how prevalent of a motif sickness and physicianship, I guess, and disease and all that. I never realized what a prevalent sort of motif in One Piece that was. Zoro's whole motivation comes from a fear of death, not a fear of the meaning of death, but the fear of physically dying, physical weakness and inadequacy, which makes it interesting why Zoro was basically incapacitated for most of the Drum Island arc. Sanji, his whole arc comes from the fact that medicine was used to pervert his genetics, to turn him into something that he's not. Medicine is such an important thematic vehicle in One Piece. Thanks for watching, y'all. Make sure to dislike and unsubscribe and leave hateful comments. Thank you.